THG rate stars clue easy. No alarms rang, no emergency meetings were broadcast, no breaking news banners warned the public. And yet on January 1st, 2026, the global financial system quietly crossed a line it would never be able to uncross. While the world was distracted by holiday celebrations, interest rate speculation, and artificial intelligence headlines, something far more important was happening beneath the surface of the global economy. Something physical, something irreversible. The flow of real metal changed direction. For nearly a century, the Western financial system had been built on a simple illusion that paper promises were as good as the real thing. That gold stored somewhere else could be sold 10, 20, even 100 times over. That silver contracts could circulate endlessly without anyone ever asking for delivery. And for decades that illusion worked. Because no one demanded the bars. Until they did, the shift did not begin with a declaration of war, nor with a treaty signed under flashing cameras. It began with shipping manifests, customs codes, and warehouse withdrawals that most analysts ignored. Ignored because they didn't look dramatic. Ignored because they didn't move stock markets. At first, ignored because they came from places the financial world had been trained to underestimate. India, China. Two civilizations older than Western finance itself. For generations, they were rivals, border clashes, trade disputes, diplomatic tension, competing ambitions for influence across Asia. To most observers, the idea that New Delhi and Beijing could ever coordinate strategically seemed unrealistic. But history does not move according to headlines, it moves according to incentives. And by the mid-2020s, the incentives were impossible to ignore. The US dollar had become a weapon. Sanctions, asset freezes, trade restrictions, and financial exclusions had transformed the global reserve currency into a tool of coercion. Any nation holding large reserves of dollars, or relying on Western clearing systems, now lived under a permanent threat: comply or be cut off. China understood this earlier than most. India learned it the hard way, and both reached the same conclusion. Paper wealth is not sovereignty. Only physical assets are. Gold, silver, energy, industrial metals. Things that cannot be frozen with a keystroke. By 2024, China had already spent years quietly restructuring its relationship with commodities. Mining regulations tightened. Export licenses were restricted. Strategic reserves expanded. Domestic consumption was prioritized over global supply. But China alone could not break the system. Because the system's weakness was not at the mines, it was at the vaults. London, the heart of the global bullion trade, the clearing center for paper gold and paper silver, the place where more metal was sold every day than physically existed. The London Bullion Market Association didn't trade bars. It traded confidence. Confidence that delivery would never be demanded at scale. Confidence that contracts could always be rolled, settled in cash, or delayed quietly. Confidence that the East would continue accepting paper claims instead of metal. That confidence was misplaced. India's role in the coming storm was misunderstood by nearly everyone. Western analysts saw India as a developing economy, a consumer, a buyer of jewelry, not a player in financial power. They failed to understand one crucial fact. India does not buy gold and silver for speculation. India buys metal for possession. For thousands of years, Indian households had treated gold and silver not as investments, but as savings, security, and sovereignty, passed through generations, stored privately, outside banks, outside governments. By the 2020s, that cultural instinct aligned perfectly with geopolitical necessity. As global trade realigned and BRICS institutions expanded, India faced a simple choice: continue relying on a dollar-centric system increasingly hostile to strategic autonomy, or secure its future in physical form. It chose the latter. Quietly, methodically, legally, and it found a loophole: Dubai. Officially, it was just a trading hub, a neutral marketplace, a logistics center. Unofficially, it became the pressure valve that broke London. Gold and silver flowing out of Western vaults were not shipped directly to India. That would have raised red flags. Instead, metal moved first to Dubai under existing trade frameworks. From there, it entered India under favorable tax treatment, regulatory exemptions, and reclassification rules that made the transactions appear routine. No sanctions violated, no rules broken, no headlines generated, just metal leaving. Day after day, week after week, month after month. By the time analysts noticed inventory declines, it was already too late. Silver was the first to strain. Unlike gold, silver is not just a store of value. It is an industrial necessity. Solar panels, electronics, defense systems, medical equipment, energy infrastructure. The green energy transition had already tightened supply. Military demand had surged. And now, physical silver was disappearing into private and sovereign hands, never to return to exchanges. Paper prices didn't reflect it. They couldn't. Paper markets price confidence, not reality. But fabricators felt it. Refiners felt it. Defense contractors felt it. Delays, premiums, temporary shortages. The language softened the truth. There wasn't enough metal. China's role completed the trap. While India drained the vaults, China secured the source. New export controls restricted raw material flows. Strategic metals were reclassified as national security assets. Mining output was redirected internally. Foreign access tightened. No announcement declared a global supply shock. But the math changed, and markets always obey math eventually. By late 2025, London's free float was a fiction. Bars listed on balance sheets were already spoken for. Allocated metal was rehypothecated. Unallocated accounts multiplied claims on shrinking reserves. It worked until someone asked for delivery. January 1st, 2026 wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. A routine rollover that didn't roll. A settlement that couldn't be settled. A delivery request that revealed an uncomfortable truth. The metal wasn't there. Cash settlement was offered, then encouraged, then quietly required. And that was the moment the world's monetary era changed. Because once a market admits it cannot deliver the asset at prices, it ceases to be a market. It becomes a narrative. Trust evaporated. Not all at once. Not in panic, but irrevocably. Central banks noticed first, then sovereign funds, then militaries. The U.S. Department of Defense had a problem it couldn't solve with money. Silver shortages affected guidance systems, communications equipment, and advanced electronics. Supply chains stretched. Costs exploded. Lead times doubled. Money could buy contracts. But contracts couldn't buy metal. The realization spread. If the most powerful military on Earth couldn't secure critical materials through financial markets, what did paper wealth really mean? The answer was uncomfortable. It meant nothing without physical backing. BRICS didn't announce victory. They didn't need to. The system collapsed under its own weight. This wasn't a hostile takeover. It was a withdrawal of belief. And belief, once gone, never returns. The silence that followed was louder than any market crash. There was no single announcement declaring the failure of London's bullion system. No emergency press conference from the LBMA. No confession from central banks. Instead, there was hesitation, a pause, a subtle change in language that only insiders noticed. Temporary dislocations, logistical bottlenecks, extraordinary demand conditions. Words chosen carefully to avoid the truth, because the truth was simple and dangerous. The West no longer controlled price discovery for real money. For decades, price had been set by leverage, by futures contracts layered on top of futures contracts, by an assumption that nobody would ever demand delivery all at once. That assumption allowed a small quantity of metal to support a massive financial structure. India and China didn't attack that structure directly. They stepped away from it. That was the genius. China never needed London to collapse publicly. It only needed Western markets to become irrelevant to physical reality. Every ton of metal kept inside Chinese borders reduced exposure to paper pricing. Every restriction on exports tightened the invisible noose around a system built on abundance it no longer possessed. India's move was even more culturally aligned. Gold and silver did not flow into Indian ETFs. They did not flow into banks. They flowed into private hands, family vaults, religious institutions, and long-term sovereign storage. Metal that enters India rarely comes back out. That wasn't a trade. It was absorption. Western analysts kept looking for confrontation, tariffs, sanctions, naval blockades. They were searching for a geopolitical event, not a civilizational shift. They missed the most important signal of all. Modi and Xi stopped talking publicly about borders. Behind closed doors, the logic was brutally pragmatic. Neither leader trusted the dollar system anymore. Neither wanted open conflict while the global order was fragmenting. Both understood that real power in the coming decades would belong to whoever controlled resources, not narratives. This wasn't friendship. It was alignment of necessity. The BRICS framework gave them cover. New development bank settlements expanded. Local currency trade increased. Energy deals bypassed traditional clearing systems. Gold quietly re-entered the conversation as neutral collateral, not as a return to a gold standard, but as an escape from paper dependency. Western commentators laughed. Gold was barbarous, silver was too volatile, hard assets were obsolete. Those words only make sense in a world where trust is unlimited. Trust was now the scarcest commodity on Earth. The United States felt the shift before it understood it. Treasury auctions became harder to fill without subtle intervention. Foreign central banks slowed purchases. Repos required more backstopping. Liquidity appeared strong, but only because the Federal Reserve stood behind everything. A system propped up by confidence cannot afford doubt. Silver exposed the fragility faster than gold, because silver is unforgiving. You can fake gold ownership longer. Central banks can lease it, swap it, reclassify it, pretend it still exists. Silver must be used. Once it's consumed, it's gone. The U.S. defense industry discovered this the hard way. Projects were delayed. Substitutions were attempted. Costs rose beyond projections. Procurement officers began asking uncomfortable questions. Where exactly was the metal supposed to come from? Paper contracts said supply was abundant. Reality said otherwise. Meanwhile, Western investors remained calm. Too calm. Markets had trained them well. Every crisis since 2008 had been met with liquidity, stimulus, and reassurance. Why should this be different? Because this crisis wasn't financial. It was physical. You can print currency. You cannot print atoms. When Western banks offered higher premiums for immediate delivery, it didn't solve the problem. It confirmed it. Premiums are admissions of scarcity. The moment spreads widened permanently, the game was over. January 1st, 2026 became the symbolic marker, not because everything broke that day, but because nothing went back to normal after it. Delivery times extended, settlement terms changed, confidence fractured. Quietly, smart money adjusted. Not retail investors chasing headlines, institutions. Sovereign funds rebalanced, central banks diversified reserves, defense planners stockpiled quietly. The dollar didn't collapse overnight. It weakened structurally. A reserve currency doesn't die in panic, it dies in preference. More trade settled outside it, more reserves held elsewhere, more contracts priced in alternatives. BRICS didn't need a new global currency to replace the dollar. They only needed to reduce its monopoly. That was enough. The Bretton Woods system had always depended on faith. Faith that dollars could be converted into real value when necessary. Faith that the issuer would remain responsible. Faith that the rules would apply equally. That faith eroded one sanction at a time. By the mid-2020s, holding dollars meant trusting politics. History teaches what happens next. Empires don't fall because enemies destroy them. They fall because their promises stop being believed. Western media framed the shift as fragmentation, as inefficiency, as chaos. They never called it what it was: decentralization of power. For the first time since World War II, resource, rich in population, heavy nations were aligning outside Western control without firing a shot. The pincer attack was complete. India held the metal, China held the mines, the West held the paper. And paper, once exposed, burns quickly. The greatest irony was that none of this required secrecy. The data was public. Shipping logs existed. Export regulations were documented. But understanding requires abandoning assumptions. The assumption that markets are always liquid. The assumption that price reflects reality. The assumption that financial sophistication equals control. Those assumptions belong to a fading era. The new era valued tangibility, weight, possession, jurisdiction. In private briefings, Western officials used a phrase they never allowed into public statements: loss of pricing power. That phrase carried enormous implications. If you cannot set the price of money, you cannot control capital flows. If you cannot control capital flows, you cannot finance deficits indefinitely. If you cannot finance deficits, your geopolitical reach shrinks. Not dramatically, gradually. And gradual decline is the most dangerous kind because it feels manageable until it isn't. History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes with precision. The Roman Empire debased its coinage. Spain drained its silver. Britain lost sterling dominance quietly. Each believed their system was exceptional. Each was wrong. The Great Eastern Squeeze was not a rebellion against the West. It was a return to reality. A reminder that wealth ultimately resides in things that exist, not claims that promise they might. And once the world remembers that lesson, it never forgets it again. The realization spread unevenly. Some understood immediately. Others resisted. Most denied it. Denial is comforting when the alternative demands change. Western pension funds continued allocating capital based on models that assumed infinite liquidity. Asset managers reassured clients that diversification protected them. Governments spoke of resilience, innovation, and soft landings. But beneath the language, something fundamental had shifted. The world no longer agreed on what money was. For centuries, money had been whatever the strongest power said it was. Gold coins stamped with imperial faces, paper notes backed by faith, digital entries protected by law. That era relied on enforcement. The new era relied on consent, and consent was being withdrawn. China never announced a gold-backed yuan. That would have been too obvious, too confrontational. Instead, it did something far more effective. It made the yuan useful. Energy contracts settled smoothly. Trade corridors expanded. Infrastructure financing flowed without dollar exposure. Gold sat quietly on balance sheets, not as a promise, but as insurance. India followed a parallel path, but one shaped by democracy and culture. Its central bank accumulated steadily while its population accumulated instinctively. Weddings absorbed ounces. Temples absorbed tons. Rural savings converted paper income into metal before inflation could erode it. This wasn't speculation. It was memory. Civilizations that survive long enough remember what fails. The West, by contrast, had forgotten scarcity. An entire generation grew up believing markets were eternal and supply chains automatic. They had never experienced a world where something simply could not be bought, regardless of price. Silver reintroduced that concept brutally. By mid-2026, industrial users were competing directly with investors for supply. Long-term contracts were rewritten, clauses invoked, force majeure whispered behind legal language. Governments intervened quietly. Strategic stockpiles were reviewed. Export permissions reconsidered. Friendly nations received priority. Others didn't. Geopolitics returned to materials. Not ideology, not values, not speeches. Materials. The European Union faced a dilemma it couldn't vote its way out of. Green transition targets demanded silver, intensive technologies. But supply was tightening, not expanding. Recycling helped, but not enough. Substitution compromised performance. The math didn't work. The United States attempted to respond the only way it knew how. Liquidity. Rates were adjusted. Facilities expanded. Balance sheets stretched. The financial system remained calm, but increasingly disconnected from the physical economy it was supposed to serve. Money flowed. Metal didn't. That divergence became impossible to ignore. Gold behaved differently. Gold didn't vanish into consumption. It vanished into silence. Vaults remained closed. Holdings were classified. Audits delayed. Transparency reduced. Gold's price rose, but not explosively. Not in a way that warned the public. Because gold's real function isn't panic, it's migration. Slow movement of trust from one system to another. Silver screamed. Gold whispered. Together, they rewrote the hierarchy of assets. Stocks became claims on earnings denominated in currencies whose purchasing power was increasingly questioned. Bonds became promises dependent on fiscal discipline that no longer existed. Real estate rose, but required functioning credit markets to transact. Metal required nothing. No counterparty, no permission, no rollover. That simplicity frightened policymakers. A system built on leverage cannot tolerate an exit that cannot be controlled. Western governments debated responses. Some suggested commodity agreements. Others floated digital currencies backed by nothing but regulation. A few proposed partial metal backing, quickly dismissed as impractical. Impractical meant uncontrollable. Meanwhile, BRICS coordination deepened, not formally, but functionally. Trade invoicing diversified. Bilateral swaps expanded. Settlement mechanisms multiplied. There was no single replacement system. That was the point. Decentralization isn't efficient, it's resilient. The United States still possessed immense power, military reach, technological leadership, cultural influence. But financial dominance had always been its silent weapon. That weapon was dulling. Not because of hostility, but because of overuse. Every sanction taught the same lesson: money inside the system isn't yours. So nations began moving outside it. The irony was cruel. The West had championed globalization, free markets, and open trade, then weaponized the infrastructure that made them possible. The response was inevitable: disengagement. Not isolation, optionality. January 1st, 2026 didn't mark collapse. It marked choice. The choice to no longer pretend that paper and reality were interchangeable. From that point on, every contract, every reserve decision, every long-term plan included a question that had once been unthinkable. What if delivery is demanded? That question haunted everything. Banks shortened maturities. Funds reduced leverage. Governments increased secrecy. Transparency is a luxury of abundance. Scarcity breeds opacity. The average citizen noticed nothing at first. Inflation felt familiar. Prices rose, wages lagged. Central banks blamed supply shocks, geopolitics, climate, anything but structure. But subtle changes appeared. Certain products became unavailable. Certain projects were delayed indefinitely. Certain, temporary, measures never ended. History was repeating, but quietly. Empires rarely collapse in flames. They dissolve in paperwork. Forms that change, rules that shift, exceptions that multiply. Until one day, the old system still exists, but nobody uses it anymore. That day was approaching. And somewhere in a vault in India, a bar of silver sat untouched. Somewhere in China, a mine operated for domestic needs only. Somewhere in London, a ledger balanced perfectly, without the metal it described. Three realities. Only one was real. The gap widened. Not suddenly, not violently, but relentlessly. By late 2026, the global system was still functioning on paper. Stock markets traded, bonds settled, currencies exchanged, the illusion of continuity held. But beneath it, incentives had inverted. In the old system, liquidity was king. Assets that could be sold instantly were prized above all else. Speed equaled safety. Flexibility equaled intelligence. In the new system, permanence mattered more. Assets that could not be diluted, frozen, or redefined gained quiet respect. Assets that required patience instead of leverage began to anchor portfolios. This wasn't ideology. It was adaptation. Central banks didn't announce it, but their behavior betrayed them. Gold leasing slowed. Repatriation discussions resurfaced. Audit language softened. Held in custody, replaced, owned outright, in more disclosures than anyone wanted to admit. Silver was no longer discussed openly. That alone told the story. You don't publicize shortages you cannot resolve. The U.S. military's procurement problem became the most closely guarded secret in Washington. Congressional committees heard classified briefings. Contractors requested exemptions. Engineers redesigned components to reduce silver loadings, sometimes at the cost of performance. The question that echoed through closed rooms was simple. How did we let this happen? The answer was uncomfortable, because the system rewarded financial efficiency over physical resilience for too long. Outsourcing production made balance sheets cleaner. Just in-time inventories reduced costs. Financial derivatives replaced stockpiles. It worked, until it didn't. India never had that problem. Its inefficiencies were its strength. Millions of households acting independently created a decentralized reserve system no central planner could design. No algorithm could predict, no sanction could touch it. When Indian demand surged, it wasn't a trade. It was a migration of value. China's approach was colder, more strategic. Mines were not nationalized in dramatic fashion. They were regulated. Environmental standards tightened. Energy costs adjusted. Export permits delayed. Each change was defensible in isolation. Together, they locked supply behind borders. The West protested quietly. Diplomats negotiated. Trade bodies issued concerns. Nothing changed, because there was no rule that required China to sell strategic resources to anyone. That assumption had been cultural, not legal. The petrodollar system began to feel the pressure next. Energy had always been the dollar's backbone. Price oil in dollars, recycle surpluses into treasuries, maintain demand for the currency. But energy producers watched what happened to reserves frozen elsewhere. They learned the lesson quickly. Diversification was no longer optional. Bilateral energy deals settled in alternative currencies expanded. Some referenced gold implicitly. Others used baskets. None announced a break. They simply added choices. Choice erodes monopolies faster than rebellion ever could. Digital currencies were proposed as solutions. Central bank digital currencies promised efficiency, traceability, control. They solved none of the underlying problems. A digital dollar is still a dollar. It can still be frozen. It can still be inflated. It still depends on trust. Hard assets do not. That difference became obvious as volatility increased. Whenever markets wobbled, capital didn't flee to innovation or growth. It fled to certainty. Gold, silver, energy, land. Not because they were exciting, but because they were boring in the right way. Predictable, finite, unforgiving. The wealth transfer accelerated not upward or downward, but inward. From paper claims to physical possession. From global abstractions to local control. Western governments attempted narrative control. They spoke of modernization, of resilience, of transition pains. They avoided one word entirely: decline. Because decline implies inevitability, and inevitability removes political agency. But history doesn't require permission. It moves when conditions align. The Bretton Woods order had survived crises before: wars, inflation, debt explosions, but it had never faced a coordinated withdrawal of belief. That was new. The most dangerous moment for any system is when its defenders no longer believe in it, but continue operating it out of habit. That's when cracks become structural. Financial engineers tried to patch the bullion markets with new instruments, enhanced liquidity facilities, alternative settlement mechanisms, synthetic exposure products. They added complexity to solve a problem caused by excess complexity. It didn't work. Each new layer increased distance from reality, and reality was becoming expensive. By 2027, pricing mechanisms diverged openly. Paper prices existed. Physical prices existed. They were no longer the same. Premiums became permanent. Delivery windows extended into quarters. Some contracts stopped offering delivery entirely. When a market prices something it cannot provide, it is no longer a market, it is theater. The smart participants left the audience. They moved backstage into private deals, direct sourcing, long-term offtake agreements. Transparency decreased. Efficiency declined. Security improved. The world was becoming less optimized and more survivable. Western citizens felt the effects slowly. Retirement projections softened. Infrastructure projects stalled. Defense budgets ballooned without corresponding capacity gains. The math of abundance had been replaced by the math of trade-offs. Every ounce allocated here was unavailable there. Every choice excluded alternatives. This was unfamiliar territory. For decades, the West had enjoyed optionality without sacrifice. That era ended quietly. India and China didn't celebrate. They prepared. Strategic reserves were not talked about on television. They were discussed in planning documents, in logistics schedules, in long-term demographic models. The goal wasn't dominance, it was insulation. Insulation from sanctions, from volatility, from dependence. The irony was sharp. The very system built to ensure Western stability had encouraged others to build parallel structures, not hostile ones, redundant ones. Redundancy looks wasteful until it saves you. By the time Western policymakers accepted what was happening, the leverage was gone. You cannot threaten a system that does not need you. You cannot coerce trade that no longer routes through your channels. You cannot set prices for goods you do not control. This wasn't a sudden fall. It was gravity reasserting itself. Civilizations with population, production, and resources regained pricing power. Civilizations built on consumption and leverage adjusted downward, not into collapse, into normalization. History had always been multipolar. The unipolar moment was the anomaly. January 1st, 2026 simply marked the moment the world stopped pretending otherwise. And in the end, there was no villain, only arithmetic. Debts compound, resources deplete, trust erodes. Systems that ignore these truths eventually reconcile with them. The Great Eastern Squeeze wasn't an attack, it was an accounting. And the ledger finally balanced against those who believed paper was enough. The adjustment phase began without ceremony. There was no reset button, no summit that rewrote the rules. No moment where the old order officially ended and the new one began. Instead, institutions adapted quietly or failed quietly. Banks extended maturities to hide stress. Governments reclassified spending to mask strain. Statistical agencies adjusted baskets to soften inflation optics. Everything remained technically functional. But function is not health. The financial system had become a patient kept alive by intervention, not vitality. Meanwhile, outside the glare of markets, a different logic governed decisions. Resource security replaced growth as the primary objective. Countries stopped asking how fast they could expand and started asking how long they could endure. That shift alone rewrote priorities. Infrastructure projects were redesigned around material availability, not cost optimization. Defense strategies emphasized stockpiles over speed. Trade agreements focused on guaranteed access rather than best price. This wasn't regression, it was realism. China formalized long-term supply corridors across Central Asia and Africa. Not extractive raids, but structured arrangements that exchanged infrastructure and financing for predictable flows of raw materials. India deepened regional trade in South Asia and the Middle East, anchoring settlements in tangible value rather than currency promises. Gold-linked trade credits reappeared in disguised forms, never announced, always implied. The West noticed, but too late to prevent normalization. Because once a practice becomes routine, it stops being controversial. Gold regained its original role without fanfare. Not as a currency, not as a standard, but as the ultimate collateral. When trust between parties weakened, gold closed the gap. When contracts extended over decades, gold anchored confidence. When politics interfered, gold neutralized risk. Silver remained the choke point. Its dual nature, monetary and industrial, made it impossible to ignore. Every technological ambition collided with its physical limits. Solar expansion, electrification, defense modernization, medical innovation all demanded silver. And silver did not respond to financial incentives. Higher prices did not instantly produce more supply. New mines required years, recycling at ceilings, substitution degraded outcomes. Scarcity became policy relevant. For the first time in generations, Western planners were forced to think like civilizations, not corporations. You cannot optimize your way out of depletion. The public conversation lagged reality by years. Media debates focused on politics, personalities, culture wars. Attention remained fragmented. The true story unfolded in trade balances, reserve disclosures, and procurement delays, places few citizens ever looked. That was not an accident. Systems rarely advertised their vulnerabilities, but people felt it anyway. Opportunities narrowed. Social mobility slowed. Stability became conditional. The promise that each generation would do better than the last weakened, not dramatically, but persistently. That erosion mattered more than any headline crash. Empires lose legitimacy before they lose power. When citizens sense the system no longer works for them, belief erodes. And belief is the invisible currency of governance. The West still possessed wealth, but it was increasingly illiquid. Paper wealth cannot rebuild supply chains. Paper wealth cannot mine metal. Paper wealth cannot substitute time. Those constraints shaped the next decade. Younger nations adjusted faster. They had fewer illusions to abandon. Older systems struggled, not because they were incapable, but because they were optimized for a world that no longer existed. The final irony was subtle. The Great Eastern Squeeze did not impoverish the West. It humbled it. It forced a recalibration from dominance to participation, from rule-maker to stakeholder, from issuer of value to negotiator of access. That transition was uncomfortable, but survivable. History's harshest punishments are reserved for those who refuse to adapt. January 1st, 2026 was remembered not as a catastrophe, but as a reference point. The moment analysts stopped asking, will this happen, and started asking, how far has it already gone? Because by then, the answer was clear. The world had already moved on, and money, real money, had moved with it. But the long consequences unfolded slowly, the way all permanent changes do. There was no single year historians could circle and declare, this is when it ended. Instead, textbooks would later describe a span of time, a transition period, when the old assumptions quietly expired and new ones took their place. By the late 2020s, the language of finance itself had changed. Words like risk-free disappeared from serious discussion. So did guaranteed liquidity. Even safe haven was used cautiously now, often followed by qualifiers and footnotes. Nothing was absolute anymore, except scarcity. Governments began competing not for capital, but for materials. Diplomatic relationships were reassessed through the lens of access. Alliances shifted subtly, not because of ideology, but because of supply chains. Who could deliver? Who could store? Who could wait? Waiting became power. China could wait. India could wait. The West, built on quarterly cycles and electoral calendars, found waiting uncomfortable. This difference reshaped negotiations. When Western officials pushed for urgency, their counterparts often declined politely. Deadlines slipped. Timelines extended. Patience became leverage. It was never stated outright, but everyone understood the dynamic. Those who needed immediate resolution were not in control. The bullion markets stabilized in appearance, but never recovered their former authority. London remained a hub, but no longer the hub. New regional pricing centers emerged, each tied more closely to physical settlement than paper abstraction. Price discovery fragmented. That fragmentation confused investors trained on singular benchmarks. Arbitrage opportunities appeared, then vanished as access tightened. Information asymmetry increased. Markets became less fair. They became more real. Transparency had been a luxury of abundance. Scarcity rewarded discretion. Private contracts replaced public exchanges. Long-term offtake agreements displaced spot pricing. Relationships mattered more than screens. Finance returned to its original state trust between parties, collateralized by things that existed. For ordinary people, the lesson arrived gradually. Savings held purely in financial instruments felt increasingly abstract. Retirement accounts grew nominally but shrank in purchasing power. Promises extended decades into the future felt less convincing. People adapted instinctively. They diversified locally. They valued durability over novelty. They measured wealth less by numbers and more by resilience. This wasn't panic. It was intuition. Civilizations survive by rediscovering old truths when new systems fail them. Gold resumed its ancient role not as a get-rich scheme, but as a memory device, a reminder of limits. Silver became strategic again, discussed in planning rooms rather than trading floors. The West didn't disappear. It recalibrated. Manufacturing slowly returned where feasible. Stockpiles were rebuilt. Education shifted toward engineering and materials science. Growth expectations were lowered, but made more achievable. The fantasy of infinite expansion faded. In its place came sustainability, not as a slogan, but as necessity. Looking back, historians would note something important. The Great Eastern Squeeze didn't begin in 2026. It merely became visible then. It had started decades earlier, when leverage replaced reserves, when efficiency replaced redundancy, when trust replaced verification. January 1st, 2026 was the moment the bill arrived. Not all at once, not catastrophically, but conclusively. And the world paid it not with collapse, but with adjustment. That is how financial orders really end. Not in fire, but in quiet acceptance that the rules have changed and will never change back. The final stage was not collapse, but normalization. By the early 2030s, the shock had fully passed, not because the system healed, but because the world learned to live without the illusions that once sustained it. Financial television still existed. Charts still moved. Analysts still argued. But fewer people believed them. Markets were no longer seen as mirrors of reality, only as reflections of sentiment. Useful but incomplete, powerful but not authoritative. Authority had shifted elsewhere, to warehouses, to ports, to mines, to long-term contracts written without exit clauses. Power migrated to those who could deliver, not those who could promise. This was the quiet victory of the East, not through conquest, but through patience. China never replaced the dollar. India never declared monetary independence. BRICS never announced a new world currency. They didn't need to. They let the old system hollow itself out. By the time the West fully recognized what had happened, the question was no longer how to reverse it, but how to coexist with the new reality. And that reality was simple. Money had reattached itself to matter. Not formally, not legally, but behaviorally. Gold was not money, but no serious institution ignored it. Silver was not currency, but no industrial planner dismissed it. Energy was not finance, but it dictated finance's limits. The separation between economics and physics had ended. That reunion reshaped education, planning, and ambition. Economic models grew humbler. Forecasts shortened. Risk committees gained authority over growth committees. A slower world emerged, not poorer, but more constrained. For many, that felt like loss. For history, it was correction. Empires rise when they master reality. They fall when they try to abstract it away. The Great Eastern Squeeze forced a reckoning. It reminded the world that value is not declared, it is extracted, refined, protected, and stored. That sovereignty is not printed, it is secured. That trust, once stretched too far, snaps quietly. And perhaps the most important lesson of all was this. No financial order is permanent, but everyone ends the same way, when people stop believing in it and start preparing for what comes after. January 1st, 2026 did not mark the end of the world. It marked the end of pretending. And once pretending stops, reality always wins. Other memory of the old order faded faster than anyone expected. New generations did not miss what they never relied on. Young planners, engineers, and policymakers entered institutions without emotional attachment to the dollar's former dominance or London's historic authority. To them, multipolar finance was normal. Fragmented pricing was normal. Physical constraints were normal. What felt like decline to some felt like clarity to others. Universities stopped teaching markets as self-correcting miracles and started teaching them as human systems bounded by materials, energy, and time. Economics slowly rejoined engineering. Finance rejoined logistics. That reunion changed everything. National strategies were written with inventories listed before budgets. Security doctrines ranked metals alongside missiles. Energy planners spoke the language of geology, not ideology. The illusion of abstraction was gone. In private, even Western leaders admitted it. The mistake had never been debt itself. The mistake was believing debt could replace substance indefinitely. Once that belief collapsed, behavior changed. Trade wars lost meaning when supply chains were already regionalized. Sanctions lost bite when reserves were diversified. Financial threats sounded hollow when targets no longer depended on access. Power became quieter. It expressed itself in reliability, not intimidation. Those who could guarantee delivery earned influence. Those who could not learned restraint. The world became less theatrical and more serious. Looking back, analysts would note that the pincer attack label was misleading. India and China did not coordinate every step. They didn't need to. Their incentives aligned naturally once the risks of paper dependence became undeniable. History often works that way. Parallel decisions, not secret conspiracies, move the world. One civilization absorbed metal, another secured production, a third continued issuing promises. Only one of those strategies aged well. The West adapted not all at once, not evenly, but enough to endure. It retained innovation, culture, and influence. What it lost was monopoly, and monopoly, once broken, never returns. By the time the story was taught openly, the drama had vanished. January 1st, 2026 became a footnote, a marker historians used to explain why things were different afterward, not why they broke. Because nothing broke. It simply stopped pretending to be something it wasn't. Money stopped pretending to be infinite. Markets stopped pretending to be neutral. Power stopped pretending to be benevolent. And the world, stripped of illusion, became more honest, if less comfortable. That is how eras end, not with collapse, but with understanding. What the final understanding settled in quietly, without applause. By the mid-2030s, no one serious argued anymore about whether the shift had happened. The debate had moved on to something else entirely. How to live inside it. The generation that remembered, before, still compared, still measured loss against memory. But the generation that came after measured only what worked. They didn't care who once set prices. They cared who could deliver. That difference reshaped ambition. Careers were built around materials, not models. Influence flowed to those who controlled logistics, refining, storage, and energy flows. Quiet professions gained status. Loud speculation lost it. The heroes of the new era were not traders, they were planners. The Great Eastern Squeeze became a case study taught without drama,